Hello and welcome to Developer Marketing Stories. My name is Matthew Ravel
And I'm Adam Duvander. Today we are hearing from Alyss Noland about launching GitHub Copilot. This was a project with a lot of attention, and this is a story from someone who was there at the very beginning.
One of the reasons we're doing this podcast is to share with you about our training and coaching program for developer marketing professionals. It's called Developer Marketing in Practice, and you get a mixture of coaching, learn at your own pace training, and also live sessions with experts in different areas of developer marketing. If you want to find out more, go to developer.marketing.
One of the things that stood out to me about this is it has something for anyone listening. It has the elements of a startup. So you have a brand new product, something that has never been done before, and you have to understand what it is so that you can tell developers about it. And then it also has all the elements of working for a large company. So this is GitHub, which itself is big, part of Microsoft, which is even bigger. And so you have all the collaboration and the sign-off and the discussions that need to happen for a large company, all wrapped into a great story about what it takes to build and launch a developer product. All right, Alyss, welcome. And we're real excited to learn about your experience with Copilot. So take us to that moment where someone told you about this new product and said, we need your help.
One day, I was effectively one of three people sitting on the product marketing team at the time, but I was one of the only people actually working on product launches. And by one of the only, I do kind of mean the only. And so I was pulled into the Slack channel along with the executive sponsor and a few other of the important individuals while this was still with the innovation team, GitHub Next. And they said, we're working on getting this thing to like a kind of like alpha state. We want to get it towards being in the hands of some developers, and we need a marketer on it, specifically like a product marketer. And I had already built a lot of trust with the product team and built a lot of trust with some of these specific individuals, having worked on code spaces. And so I'm coming up to the Code Spaces launch. I'm coming up to like the new issues experience launch. I also had State of the Octaverse reports on my plate. Basically every P0 launch for about a year period of time was on my plate. And now I'm thinking about, now I have to add this other thing. And I'm also supporting 90 product managers for the entire GitHub org. So in the moment I was like, kind of come hell or high water, like I need to figure out what my priorities are and what I need to reshuffle and like how to kind of redistribute some of these things or what's going to drop. Because I can't let this go to chance. Like I can't let this go without my contributions, not because I think so highly of myself, but because it's so rare sometimes in dev tools to have that trust of the product management team. You don't want to forsake that trust and like leave them hanging. The other thing is, because there had been so few launches of this kind in the recent or historic past, that was going to be like a very tricky space to navigate, not only from the unknown legal like standpoint, from the community standpoint, from the how are you doing the science communication and like how does this thing work. So I was thinking about like all those different aspects of like the challenges and the nuance and like, yeah, it's definitely like a career builder. So like I was it, like I needed to figure kind of those things out. And so the initial response to by my skip level was like, oh, well, the PMM team doesn't have bandwidth. And I was like, okay.
That was the response to the executive sponsor who is coming with this P0 that sort of needs a new number to be associated with it because it's not low enough, right? Is that?
Yes. Yeah. And this is like, I don't think folks had quite understood yet at the time that the GitHub Copilot initiative was one of the first kind of like pilot products coming out of the relationship between Microsoft and OpenAI from the like whatever like number of months, number of years, like exclusive deal and the $1 billion plus investment. And so Satya's team, and because Satya Nadella like has not only like his like office of the CEO and like his like he has like a comms team and like PR and like they wanted to know what was going on with it, right? Like they wanted to know that there was like a plan to get this product to market. And so that was like one of the things that I that was like a disconnect between the orgs at the time was that level of like impact and importance and the attention to what exactly this thing was going to be. And so that means that was like sitting with this like very scrappy kind of like skunkworks, like researchers who could flex in a lot of ways. They could kind of be like researchers, they could explore different concepts, but they hadn't worked with marketing, like demand generation. They hadn't worked with the content marketing team and like what does the editing process look like. They hadn't worked with program management. And so I fortunately already had started to build some of these relationships with a few of these folks, and like it definitely got a lot closer relationships in the meantime. But like no product had ever like crossed that barrier. No product had ever gone from, at least as long as I had known or anyone that I had spoken to, like had something gone from GitHub Next into GitHub's like product and engineering org. And like that was still quite like clunky and like awkward and definitely some things that like could have been done better, but by all accounts, like the teams that were helping support that, tried to give a lot of grace and tried to offer support to the extent that they could. And you get a little bit of that when you have more of the startup culture.
I don't know if this is relevant, but does that mean that GitHub Actions came after Copilot, or was it just, did it not come out of GitHub Next?
GitHub Actions came before Copilot. I don't. It preceded me. So I don't have all the details on how that might have been explored. I was the most tenured person on the product marketing team at the time that I was doing all of this, and I think I had been in product marketing at GitHub for a year.
So going back to that point where you know that it's your responsibility now, it's the first time something like that's happened within working memory, let's say. Did you have a playbook or something you turned to? What was your kind of day zero, day one set of tasks to orient yourself?
Yeah. There's not necessarily a lot on the playbook. I mean, I guess there is. My approach on almost any product is you have to start understanding like who is it for, how people are going to use it, and like not just you definitely want to understand the theory. And so a lot of it for me initially, as I was joining this kind of like working group, was going and sitting in meetings and like listening to the way that the lead at the time, his name's Uga Demora, and he's since like gone and founded his own new startup. He had been brought into GitHub through an acquisition. And I would just like listen to the way that he pitched the product to like different teams. And he was very crisp on these things. He also very much understood the value of marketing. And that was part of how I kind of firmed up my idea of like, where are they seeing, because they've been playing with this thing for a while. Like it started out in like a browser. Now it's like they have been doing it in like VS Code and like moving it towards the IDE. I thought like that makes total sense. Like, why wouldn't it be in an IDE? I took some of these like decisions for granted. There's other things in there too, because that's like very much focused on like the product marketing side of things, like grokking. Again, the user empathy, like where is it in their experience? Is it frustrating? Is it making things easier? Understanding the value. This also came around the time that we already had a new paper out of Microsoft Research from Nicole Forsgren as the lead author called Space. It's called the Space of Developer Productivity, which is a framework and a predecessor to the 4 key DORA metrics. And it's a way to look at individual, team, and organizational productivity. But it's not like prescriptive. It's not saying like, oh, like if you're going to be looking at the stability or the throughput of your team, then you need to like measure these things. It's saying you need to look at like satisfaction and well-being. You need to look at, sure, like some productivity metrics or activity metrics or communication and collaboration. You need to look at the way efficiency and flow. So again, like how do those things fit in? Those were helpful and very grounding and things that I continue to go back to. But then there's the other details, right? Like I call myself the go-to-market lead on Copilot because I didn't just do product marketing on that product. So, it's not cheap to run models. It's not cheap to continue to build all of the features associated with like what is effectively an agent style. Like it's not providing autonomy to the model to like make decisions. It is like a Copilot in that way. And that is like why we decided to keep that with that name. And I really want to give credit to that team. They came with that name. I did not impart that name upon them. Uga actually, I think, was the one that originally came up with it. We persisted it. We didn't have like an agency come up with that name. And now all of Microsoft is using it. So like, congratulations to Uga. Like, hats off to him. Like it was a very astute like observation that was very much like the experience of it. And so it's like branding. Do we want this to have unique like logo marks? Do we want this to have like a unique look and feel to what's happening with GitHub? What are like branding colors going to be? How are you going to think about like some of the storytelling, especially because again, this isn't just GitHub services, right? This is also OpenAI. This is also hitting Microsoft servers. How are you going to like opt into privacy policy and then going back to like open source community, right? And now I'm even talking about like what's the legal like impact of these things? What's the community reception of these things? How are we anticipating the reception? How are we laying the groundwork? How are we anticipating the way that's going to be received? And then also, how are you seeding the community? How are you warming people up to these? How are you building the groundswell and the communication around it? How are you testing it out and validating that this is a good experience and that you've like smoothed all the rough edges? It's also anticipating like, when is your executive going to scoop you? I won't specifically name names, but like you can imagine on the heyday of Twitter that there were certain executives that were very active on Twitter. And when they felt that it was, the right moment to do so, they would post things on Twitter. And we didn't always get to do our little embargo dance with our press friends. So sometimes that meant that we just had to like react when we were reacting. And so I've touched on lots of little things, but in the whole package of this, right, is really looking at, if we're taking a step back, it's, some of it's like market trends. Where do we think this is going to go? How do we think this is going to impact the like global community and sort of the direction of things? How do we think this is going to impact people's ways of working on a micro level and thus on a macro level in a 5 to 10 year time horizon? What are the economics of it? Where do we think a payback is going to come from, if at all? And do we have a responsibility towards a payback, or are our KPIs and key metrics for this project different? And I think you can see in a lot of ways that the key metrics in some of the reporting have been different. Um, the core was really about kind of like loss leading and driving developer adoption. And that's part of why it's still free for a lot of open source maintainers and core contributors to those large projects, as well as I think they might still be doing like discounts of some kind. Like, then it's also how do you navigate the education landscape as like professors and comp sci teachers and high schools? They didn't know this stuff was coming out. I literally sent an email to my old comp sci teacher from high school and was like, hey, we just launched a new product. People are probably going to use it in order to work on your homework. You should just be aware. And he's like, thanks for letting me know. But and you know, you can imagine like there's a lot of like downstream effects of that. But I'll pause there because I could keep like going on, but
There is a lot in there, and it's clear that internally there was deliberation and intentionality. What's the timeline here from you hear about it in that Slack channel to maybe first public announcement of any sort to uh, developers being able to get their hands on it? Like, what is that timeline?
yeah. So the timeline from I'm kind of like brought in to help out to it's uh, available for people to sign up for the tech preview was about 3 months, which is that's was about standard fare for GitHub at the time. Is like, oh, product marketing only needs 3 months to do all of the go to market.
And maybe so for a product that is similar to something that someone's used to using, but this is a whole shift, right? That's a lot that happened in that time.
It is, and I will. There are some things that are made a little easier because it was a tech preview, and that gave us some flexibility. From the tech preview to GA, we had a year. So I think that was what we're talking about is kind of the difference between about June 2021 is when the tech preview became available and when that wait list became available. And then it was about July 2022 when the GA was announced, made available. And then there was a 2-month free trial off of that. So then no one paid until about August 2022. There's, of course, like details in there. But that year was, you know, a year of like iteration. It was a year of letting over 1 million developers in to try the product out in a staged approach. Can we kind of like deal with capacity? What metrics should we be paying attention to in terms of like the way the product's being adopted? Can we start to refine some of those metrics? Are they the right ones to pay attention to? Um, so I would say both still felt like a crunch. It still introduced certain like bottlenecks and limitations. So one of the ways that came out was when we were thinking about like routes to market and thinking about how is this going to be adopted. Like the first is GitHub is a predominantly US company, even though it is like an international, like I feel like this is it's like the quiet part you're not kind of not supposed to say out loud. Like it is used internationally. I don't want to discredit it for that. Tons of developers in India and like all over the world. But if you're going to price something based in USD and not localized currency and not localized pricing, then you've priced it for a US market. Plain and simple. So then we're thinking about a couple of things there, right? You're thinking about what is a US developer largely like willing to pay in order to maintain access to this? Like what's And also like what's a consumer willing to, like what's a pricing model that's palatable to a consumer? Because on an enterprise front, like what we saw at GitHub, like with you can see this like with Actions, with a few other things, especially over in like the Azure part of the world, people want to like do the commit spend, commit burn down. They want to like pay for what they use. They don't want to like they don't like the seat based pricing, because like then you have to do like seat reconciliation, and you have to think about like, does this person actually need access to this? And that itself introduces challenges. You've like Adam, I think you've done some like breakdowns of like prices and pricing models for like different companies. Like you can get into all of this and its own philosophy. Um, so again, backing up, like if you're going to think about like you want to get this into the hands of developers, you know that it is going to be a basically brave new world, and it's very innovative, and it's going to present risk, and it's going to require people very early in the technological adoption curve that are willing to navigate that. um, then how do you get it like into their hands? And at first it's free trial. Give them something that they don't have to enter a credit card for. And so the technology preview, technical preview was a great way to do that. Then it was 60-day trial. I don't really think they actually needed a 60-day. It's not 60-day any longer. It's now, I think, a 30-day or maybe less. And then it's we were effectively choosing somewhere between $10 to $20 is where we had run some models on. We also asked and surveyed users in a couple of different pricing methodologies, like what were they, where are they kind of like, what do they feel good about paying? If they like, would you be sad if you were going to lose access to this? And if you did have to like pay, like what would feel right? And 10 was like kind of validated, but also the survey that was run at the time like wasn't necessarily intended to be a pricing survey. And so we wanted, like, I would have preferred us to do something with like a little bit more rigor, but you had enough kind of like converging gut instincts, like validation for the markets that we wanted to enter. That's sort of where we landed. And that also comes with a lot of asterisks, because again, $10 a month for the GPUs and for everything else that's going into it is like not necessarily enough to pay the bills. And so, and it's certainly not going to be enough like for continued development and continued features. And so then what are you going to do there? And my initial thinking was like, do we want to do something where we say, hey, for the first 2 years, we're going to give people 50% off? And do we want to say for a certain period of time, we're going to continue, like for an unknown period, like we're going to continue to give people like a discount or a coupon code for being like early adopters. And then at a certain point after like, 1 million people or whatever have joined, then we'll like stop doing that. And then once we introduce like some pricing tiers, like we'll create some more differentiation in that, which, as you will have now seen, and something that we had already been talking about at the time that we were going through these conversations, was that business was going, like the business tier and like enterprise tiers were going to come with different features. And you try to separate those as much as you can for the needs of those like teams and like teams of teams, where developers should hopefully not need those things. And you try not to put things into those tiers that developers would need, because that is not a really good way to structure products for various reasons. And then price those things higher.
Yeah, so I wanted to take a step back, because you mentioned being go-to-market lead for this, and you've talked about go-to-market several times. What is a developer go-to-market?
I think there's several things, not the least of which is that developers have what I like to lovingly refer to as a relatively strong bullshit detector. And I think that's, depending on like who or your audience is, like maybe it's security professionals, maybe it's like researchers in the academic sense, like they might have even stronger bullshit detectors. They're looking for a certain level of evidence-based information and science communication and fidelity. You can't be fluffy. You can't say like, this is going to prevent you from introducing OWASP top 10, because it's not going to. You still have to review your code before you commit it. You still have to go through PR review. People still have to think about the change set that they're going to introduce in terms of a pull request. And unfortunately, some people aren't doing that. And those are just like us perpetuating the same sins of years past prior to Copilot existing. So, like, you know, developer go to market, I think the foundation of it is starting with that, like, you can't shy away from learning about the tools, learning about what the audience is using, learning about their day-to-day and what pains them, simply because those are not a part of your day-to-day as a marketer. And because they might be perceived as like scary or as foreign. Like, the number of things that people are willing to go to a Michelin restaurant and try something that they've never tried before. Like, you should be willing to like learn about or try a tool that you've never tried before just as quickly. And separately from that, it's also like not that dissimilar in that it's a lot of community and it's a lot of word of mouth. So, there are things that I can say as a brand that are a little bit more difficult to say as an individual, which are sometimes the claims, like, here's what we've seen people do with Copilot. But then there are things that as an individual, myself as Alyss Noland or Martin Woodward, who's currently the VP of Developer Relations, there's things that those types of individuals can say that the brands cannot. And you all have to think about that as a tool in and of itself. And it's one of the great things about the program like GitHub Stars is bringing those community users into the fold and having that trust and inviting that, if you want to call it like criticism, if you want to call it like feedback, I think Mary Thingvall has the like, DevRel is like represents the community to the company and the company to the community. And the more that that can be a very like intimate, like shared Slack channel, like bring that as close to where people are working as you can. Not only because people like your community has day jobs and you need to give them easier access to the way that they're providing this information to you, and you shouldn't expect them to show up wherever you are. But also, like, the people that you're working with, your peers, have that one space that they're working in as well, and you want those feedback loops to be really tight. I'm trying to think of some of like the other like little details in there. Even going through like we were thinking about like the pop-ups that you kind of like do as you go through the trial expiry in GitHub Copilot. What goes into the email, and again, like the claims, like what information did we need to have in like the FAQ. Again, like all this kind of goes back to from a like go-to-market lens and how developers are unique. They do want to know how it works. They do want to know how it ticks. Like, this isn't like a trust your aunt because like your aunt made this recommendation to you. Like, this isn't an MLM. It's very much like a little bit of like trust and verify. Like, some people will like go and kick the tires, but like that's still like the verify part. And so the developer buying process is, there's like that initial exploration, that deeper exploration, and then the willingness to try. And you do have to build them up towards that willingness to like explore the thing and be willing to like go through the process. And you have to make that process like not suck. So have you tried to download it? Have you like tried to go through that setup process as a product marketer or as a marketer? Like, have you tried that? Because if you haven't tried that and you haven't given that feedback to the product teams, then it might be a bad experience for like newer people. And if you haven't lowered that barrier to entry, then the more that you can make that delightful for someone who is like newer entry or like lower skill level, the more it can also be delightful for someone who's higher skill level, right? And so there's like this big bell curve and like learning curve, and you also have to think about like very concertedly, like who are you designing for? Because from the get-go, this really was not going to be for code school students. It doesn't like it certainly didn't start out that way. Now it can be in a slightly better state for people who are using code school, but like you're still going to end up with goop, right? If you don't understand what it's asking you to do. It's like sending something through Google Translate and handing it into your Spanish teacher. And so that was another part of like, what story are we trying to tell and what's going to be healthy, right? For the like long-term impact to the market that we want to have and the current state of the product. So I could continue to extrapolate on all of that, but I feel like those are some of the high notes.
Yeah, so one of the things I've always thought is that you can alienate either audience by catering to them to well, one way or the other, and that's one of the great ways of kind of differentiating developer experience and so on is by knowing your audience. So I just wanted to understand a bit more what you meant about how you can basically serve both audiences.
Yeah, when I'm talking about sort of making things easy and like delightful and serving a newer developer, and the particular stage of things that I was really thinking of is like that getting started process. It's things like how many steps do you have to go through to like set up like a CLI or to like configure like you know how many times do I have to open like my Vim editor in order to like mess with this, and then what other packages do I have to install, and do I have to switch like like do I then have to like manage like am I on Python like 3, am I on Python 2? The more that you have to go through some of like those like various like little kind of institutional like knowledge steps, the more that you start to kind of like gravitate into kind of like intermediate and like higher level like expertise knowledge, right? Like if I'm asking someone to do like an interactive rebase, like I might as well say like this isn't for beginners. Like if you have not been using Git for at least 3 years with like with a group of people, right? Because that it would necessitate that you deal with like some degree of merge conflict, then you shouldn't touch this at all. But when I'm thinking about like that getting started process, like I don't think anybody likes to sit there setting something up. Like that's not like what people are spending their time trying to get to. That's not the aha moment. So the more time that people are spending trying to get to the aha moment, and so that's really what I'm referring to there is like the more that initial developer experience thinks about a novice, thinks about like kind of like the acolyte who is like first touching the product, rather than says like, oh, like we're here for like the like old crusty like IRC dudes, so they'll figure it out. Like the more that you're kind of like creating your own like leaky funnel and leaky bucket, but I don't mean that to be a flattening of what audience you intend to serve, because that can be very alienating and that can lead you to build a product for too many people. I do still think you should be very like deliberate and very like, I mean, deliberate's a perfect word for it, right? Like if I'm building for the automotive industry or if I'm building for the games industry, I should know that they're predominantly going to be using Perforce or some other centralized version control because they don't want to check out the entire repo. They're going to have large files that they need to store. LFS isn't going to work for them. And so what they're going to need to do is they're going to need to do very specific checkouts of the exact branch or like the exact like part of their repository that they need to work in. And Git can remain like the domain of people that are working in like SaaS software microservices. Fine. That's okay.
Kind of on that, the sort of understanding the audience piece. You mentioned the skepticism and kind of trying to guess at what that skepticism is, but you also mentioned there's this early group that you had access to be able to verify that. Can you talk about something that you learned from that early group that you were able to use to be able to have a better launch or better experience for the people that came after that?
Yeah. There were several things in different regards. So the first was, I would say, like validating the initial hypotheses of like the value pillars, right? Like we had these guesses, like Uga had his idea about like what the best use cases were. So, hey, you have to write boilerplate, like repetitive code. And really the way that that kind of like framed itself up, and the messaging house, the messaging framework that I had written was in satisfaction, like increase developer satisfaction by reducing the boring shit and the boring toil of these repetitive aspects of coding. And that, I think, got relatively well validated. We had some good feedback from one of the early founders from Instagram. I'm trying to remember his name. He's now CTO, I think, somewhere. I am blanking on all these particular details. There was some other aspects as well, which is like, how much is this going to help someone pick up a programming language that they're less familiar with? Because that ended up being like a little bit more of a like exploration, I would say, was kind of like a secondary, but like a tertiary was like in kind of the almost towards like innovation. Like, am I a product manager who can't code as well, and I can pick this up and this can help me? That really depended on how well someone already kind of like spoke computer, if you will, because like you can't like go write a comment that's just like, you know, make an e-commerce cart, and like it's not going to give you enough, right? Like it might be able to find like a package that's already been made, but like it's just as likely to like make up a package name that's never existed before than it is to like actually give you all the code that you need. You have to be a lot more specific than that. You have to like, hey, I'm going to instantiate like a cart function. I'm going to instantiate like a checkout function. I'm going to instantiate like, I'm going to have to bring in like Stripe to do all these things. And so that like kind of that innovation space was a little bit more fuzzy and not something that we brought up as much. There was a little bit of validation in that, but also it happened so infrequently that it also felt like somewhat the antithesis, in that there were some researchers who, because they had read enough about some of these like deep learning algorithm topics, they could write the comments that they needed to write, but they didn't know the code well enough. And so they were able to use it to help them get to the like point that they needed to in Python or whatever. And that made some of their work go faster, and it helped them like kind of like innovate, like move forward. And unfortunately, like it's not like I have like an example that I can really show in that one. And we had a few other people that kind of like talk to those things, but again, that happens like so few and far between. Like those are kind of like more unicorns than they are almost anything else. Some of the other good examples were people who were looking at the safety behavior of Copilot. So, can I get it to like use curse words? Can I get it to use some of the like other ism type language that we tend to see as like, what are some of the other like escapes, like what we see as like kind of like prompt injection or prompt escapes now? And they were very good at like letting us know if they had succeeded in like doing that, if there were things to be concerned about, or people would just post about it on YouTube or Twitter. And it's not necessarily something that like you want to see a lot of, but And sometimes those things take a life of their own. But at the same time, like that is like someone red teaming, like that is giving you product feedback. And so they were useful in that. So there was some validation in the safeties that were present. Were there any other steps that we needed to take on the client side to handle some of the like prompt pre-processing? And again, similarly, just the utilization. So one of the things that we were looking at early on was prompt, like the suggestion acceptance. And so if we did see some reduction in suggestion acceptance, then we eventually there would be a period of time after enough like prompts or like suggestions were kind of like ignored that we would kind of go into the silent mode because we realized, hey, we're actually interrupting your flow. And you might also think about that as like, oh, well, maybe it's also saving you compute. Maybe it is. I don't really know. It wasn't really a factor. It was actually very much like in that efficiency and flow, like thinking like, how do we make this like good for a good experience for developers? And then we are also looking at it on a language standpoint. So are people accepting more suggestions in Python and JavaScript? Are there more users in any of these like pools? And then we are seeing some fuzziness sometimes in certain like DSLs or certain frameworks. And sometimes that was just based off of the training data size, right? So some of that is a little bit more like product oriented, but again, goes back to, messaging and how are you thinking about the way that this stuff gets communicated back out and what are you putting in like safety and trust centers?
You've already touched on this was a lot to get through, it was there were moments of crunch and so on, but were there any particular low points where you just felt it wasn't going to be possible to get it done?
I want to say with a certain level of confidence that I didn't have any like, wow, like this isn't gonna happen. Like I don't know how we're gonna do this. I think instead for me, my challenges more were again that like I have so much on my plate. How am I going to manage all of this? Because I was doing Copilot. I was co-authoring the 2021 State of the Octaverse with Dr. Nicole Forsgren and Dr. Rini Kayanvako at the same time that I was doing this, while I was also like managing the website creation for that. We were doing GitHub Universe, and I was like leading blog post authoring and hosting for some of those things, launching code spaces, hiring new people to the team. Like it really like didn't stop. And then again, still like there's other product managers launching other products. Like I would do these consulting sessions like, hey, what is it that you want to achieve? Like what are the challenges you're running into? And every Monday we would have these like product like release meetings, and I would sit in on those and find out what was coming in the upcoming weeks and say, hey, like what do you like, and just try to help out like the teams that were bringing other things to market, even if I wasn't like able to like support those myself. And then yet again, because like between all of these things, like I'm still also interfacing with we have a legal counsel that's like embedded with our product teams at GitHub. And that can be anywhere from, hey, if we are adding this new product to the product portfolio, we need to think about what our terms of service are. And that's going to introduce like some new data processing agreements. Hey, if we want to serve like an EU market, like, yeah, we're going to have some data residency. There's like, lots of asterisks in there. And so that was one of the relationships that I was like managing and working with quite closely was, what's the current opinion? Where does that leave us in terms of features that we need to implement and billing requirements that we have? And I Actually, I think one of the funniest fights that I got into in the whole process was that 60-day trial. So as we're coming up to the window where we were going to launch Copilot to GA, we had this discussion going in various documents and forums, and the director over product for Copilot had decided the 60-day window, like, fine, sure. And I realized that was going to land the end of the trial on a Saturday. And I was like, hey, I don't want to do that to our support team, right? It doesn't matter, first, they're not going to be as well staffed. Second, people are going to get in on a Monday if that's even like when they're getting in and like starting to use this, like if they do weekend projects, like there's just so many things that could go wrong there. Like it would be so much better for people to like see that their last day of the trial is a Monday and go enter a credit card. And like we could also see this from a trend in like past GitHub usage patterns of like people normally use it during weekdays. And I got a lot of initial pushback. Like I couldn't get that like person to budge on that. And so I brought that conversation into an executive like discussion, like an e-staff like check-in. And we were about to wrap the call and they're like, is there anything else? And I'm like, oh, actually, the free trial is going to end on a Saturday. And they're like, oh, we'll just make it a Monday. And I'm like, great idea. So that wasn't like that was not so much a like pit of despair thing, but I was frustrated because I knew that it was going to negatively impact the billing engineering team that had already done some of the work to get like us to that point of the 60 days, and they were going to have to redo some of it. And I wish I had pushed probably harder. And I think that's like one of the more frequent lessons that I think I learned through part of this process is, especially like as a woman who grew up in the US, like I was very like, I was socialized in like this very like feminine, like non-hierarchical way of like, you kind of try to like share the load, you try to like not to be the queen bee. And that doesn't net out necessarily the best in like a very like dev tools, like product and engineering like space. More often than not, like being loud, being a little bit more opinionated, like fighting for like what you want and what's right, and like not doing it like in an obnoxious way. Like you still need people to like you, like relationships are still very critical. But doing some of those things like early and often, and thinking about like the second order and third order effects of like the decisions that you have and the teams that it's going to affect, and making sure that you fight for those teams even when they're not in the room, and getting ahead of those decisions. Like if I know that it's going to affect the billing engineering team, hey, this is coming, I'm sorry that it's coming, is there anything else that I can do to make it easier on you? Trying to give those teams like a heads up, like it was, those are all things that I've like tried to implement elsewhere whenever it's possible.
Yeah, and it sounds like saying it not just once was important in this particular instance. So someone listening is about to go into maybe not a GitHub Copilot, but still an important launch for for their company and their product. So thinking back to the time when you were put into that spot, what advice would you give to yourself, or definitely to those listening as they enter that period in their own professional lives?
As marketers, product managers, like almost any role, actually, I can't emphasize enough the importance of hearing from real users who you think who are going to be your users. Obviously, we don't always know who our ideal customer profile is going to be if we haven't started selling a product, depending on like the stage those things are in. But there's no replacement for it. And the gap that I see that can grow from teams that do not have those conversations is incredibly vast from teams that are having them. The other advice is, like, the more that you can set aside your like relationship to your ego and realize that the work that you're doing is topic conflict. Like, it is, you're working on software. Like, you're working, like, it's not like life or death. It's not a hospital. It's computers. It's somebody else's computers. It's ones and zeros. It's not necessarily that important. Your identity isn't actually anchored in it, or it shouldn't be. Like, your self-worth isn't based off of like whether or not people think that you're right. Ask the question, like, find out like what it is you need to know. The more questions that you can ask, the more that you can better understand what it is that you're trying to sell, what the goals are, what the goal of the teams that you're working with are, the future, the things that are going on in the market, what your competitors are doing. Like, and you know, there's obviously like a measure to these things. You can't take in too many inputs. There has to be a point at which you stop. But that willingness to ask questions and to set aside that fear of being embarrassed or being like fearful. And again, like that topic conflict, like, it's topic conflict, not people conflict. Like, people aren't looking to fight with you. It's a fight about the subject matter. And so that advice, I think, is stuff that I'm like still trying to like kind of like reinforce and like keep in mind, because our ability to like separate like the topic conflict and the people conflict and how that intertwines with our ability to progress in our careers is quite difficult. It's not always things that our organizational like environment allows us to do, but you're an important like part in the organizational fabric and the organizational psychology and the psychological safety of like the way that these launches happen. And that itself is important to the right like ends and the right outcomes in the way that launches happen. So
Amazing. Thank you. Alyss, where can people find you?
I'm precisely Alyss on Blue Sky. I have not been particularly active. I'm Alyss Noland on LinkedIn. I'm a little bit more active there. Otherwise, probably don't look for me.
And it's ALYSS, right?
Yes.
All right.
Thank you, Adam.
Yeah.
Yes. My first name is ALYSS because I decided to make it hard for everyone, and then no land, like zero property, as a funny little Alice in Wonderland joke for everyone.
Excellent. Well, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.